We are going to frame this discussion around a what if. If you wanted to open up a company, what would you think about while determining whether you wanted to be an LLP or an LLC? By answering a few questions, you'll understand the difference between the two and make the judgment for yourself. The first thing we're going to cover is a quick definition about what is limited liability. What does it really mean just in general English terms? Then we're going to move on to operations and ownership for LLPs and LLCs. We're going to ask the two key questions you see here. Then we're going to move into protection and taxes. We're going to talk about what kind of protections LLP and LLCs offer, and the same thing for their tax schemes. And after you understand the differences and answer the questions for yourself, you'll be able to choose because you understand the difference between LLP and LLC. What is limited liability anyways? It's just a fancy term to say this. If you own a business that has some sort of limited form, basically your personal assets such as your homes, your car, your bank accounts, and so forth are protected from debt collections and claims by courts. In these sort of businesses, you run the business without having the fear or the risk of losing your personal assets. Now let's get to talking about ownership and operations for LLPs and LLCs. The first thing you need to know is what these acronyms mean. LLC is just a limited liability company, while an LLP is a limited liability partnership. You're going to hear these acronyms thrown around everywhere in the business world because they're very common. LLCs contain members, while LLPs contain partners. If you remember, limited liability partnership, hence partners. These titles are important because it defines how they pay taxes, how they manage risk, and other things. Members and partners pay their taxes differently and they operate differently. When you get down to it, LLCs can be one or more people. This is why a lot of sole proprietorships turn into LLCs. Not only for the tax advantages and the shielding for personal assets, but, if you have a company that's just going to be one person, an LLC is the only choice you have. Unlike a limited liability partnership, where you're going to have two or more people coming together that want to limit their personal liability. Now, what kind of companies do you expect in LLCs and LLPs? Well, LLCs can be anything. As you well know, sole proprietorships can be anything, any sector, any company, any industry, anything, literally. So LLCs are all over the place. There's all sorts of LLCs, everything from catering all the way to medical services. However, LLPs tend to be a little more specialized. This is what happens when professionals come together and they make a firm. For example, like a firm of a legal team, like 5 or 6 lawyers come together to make a legal firm, or 5 or 6 psychologists come together to make a treatment center, something like that. Professionals that are licensed tend to band together and make LLPs. When choosing between an LLC and LLP, you have to ask yourself, what kind of protection from liability am I going to need? For example, if you want to open an LLC, of which you'll be a member, you're going to be protected from personal liability unless you're caught for wrongdoing or mismanagement of others, which makes sense if you think about it. If you break a fiduciary duty, guess what? You might be liable, despite the fact that you are a member in an LLC. But in general, members in LLCs have protection of personal assets. Now, like LLCs, LLPs have partners, but that's a little different than members. Partners have their own liability limitations put on them, which is fine. However, they're also shielded from the wrongdoings of other partners in general. So if you own a firm with like 6 different partners, okay, you're part owner, you don't have to worry about being liable for what they do unless you were somehow involved in it. So LLPs, when you have partners, also have the liability protection against what other partners may be doing. Now, if you want to open up a company as an LLC or an LLP, or transition a sole proprietorship to one of these two forms, you're going to have to ask yourself, what kind of protection do you need? It also comes down to the other question, like we talked about in the previous slide. How many people are you going to need in this company? If it's just going to be you, one person, it's an LLC. However, if you're going to need partners, you may want to consider the LLP form. LLPs and LLCs have different tax structures, and depending upon which one you like, that will help you choose which way you want to go. Now let's cover them both very quickly in outline. As you can see, LLCs may have a pass-through taxation. However, they can also set up a different kind of taxation, like a corporation or some other form that benefits them. So when you get down to it, LLCs are extremely flexible. They can stick with pass-through taxation, or they can elect and drop some paperwork and work with a lawyer to get a different taxation strategy going. For example, being taxed as a corporation. That may have its benefit for some LLCs. Now, limited liability partners pretty much have only one form of taxation, and that's pass-through taxation given the partnership agreement. The partnership agreement says, hey, this partner pays this, that partner pays that, and so forth, and that's what everyone pays. So LLPs are a little more traditional compared to the flexible LLC. When starting a company, you're going to have to ask yourself, which one is more comfortable for you? Do you need to have the flexibility, or do you want to have the rigid taxation with partners? Everyone has a different opinion because everyone has a different type of business. It's not too hard to understand the difference between an LLC and an LLP if you frame it in the context of, hey, I want to open up a company. Which one works for me? If you can make that choice, then you know the difference. Here's a rundown to the right of the differences so you can get a good feel for this. LLCs can be any sort of business. It doesn't matter what they are. They can be anything from catering to zoological services and anything in between. They have flexible taxes because they can choose what kind of tax strategy they want to have, but generally it's some sort of pass-through. Also, their management is very flexible because they tend to be a one-person show. They tend to be a sole proprietorship that turned into an LLC to protect their own personal assets. And, as you well know, the limited liabilities are for members. Now, LLPs are a little different. Usually, this is a board of professionals coming together to make a firm. This requires some sort of partnership agreement, so there's a lot of legalese and contract stuff to work out with lawyers. However, once this is all figured out, it's pass-through taxation, everything is pretty certain, it's a very traditional kind of partnership. But most importantly, for the partner, there is shielding from other partners' mistakes in addition to their own personal shielding. This is sort of an encouraging thing to make professionals come together and form companies. Why? Because it reduces the amount of risk and uncertainty each person has to assume by forming this company. Now, given what you want to do with your company and how you think about it, you can choose an LLC or LLP. And if you can choose, you understand the difference between the two, and that's good.